John, why don't you tell us how you ended up on the show?
Well, I entered the field of technology lately, realizing that my iPod might not start a fire. I avoided them for about 10 years. Then I discovered podcast. By accident, I stumbled upon you guys just as I was teaching a quasi-philosophy class, introducing freshmen in the Honors College to the idea of liberal education. I was rereading all the stuff that I pretended to read when I was studying history and found out that I was absolutely fascinated with philosophy and loved the way you guys approached it. I wrote you guys a fan letter and never thought I was going to be on a show with you, so this is a thrill for me. I mean, you guys are really philosophers, and I want to be a philosopher. Mark, you're a rock and roller, and I know CF and G7, and this is great.
Yes, that's one of the dangers of writing fan letters to us. It's you might get recruited. You might end up having to.
So you're at Grand Valley State University, right?
Grand Valley State University, you bet.
Tell us what the things you do there. What makes you a terrorism expert? So government people come to you and ask you stuff?
Well, in my academic career, I've always tried to pick an obscure field that nobody knows anything about so that I can act like I'm an expert. And I kept changing and changing and changing to religious terrorism, and it finally caught up with me. So I just, I got interested in this stuff back in the 1970s when I was on a SWAT team on the Jackson Police Department. I had a master's in military history, and terrorism seemed very close to military history. I've also been very interested in religious terrorism, how religious messages are twisted and turned into violence. And I've just started studying and writing. Ran into Brian Jenkins from the RAND Corporation at a conference in 1983 and asked him, what should I do? He gave me a 3-step plan, and it worked. And that became my field of expertise.
You've edited several textbooks, right, on the subject of terrorism. These are pretty widely used for introductory courses.
I come from a very practical perspective, and the folks who like my work tend to be military folks, security folks, and law enforcement people. The folks who don't like my work are folks on the theoretical side because I don't examine a lot of theory. For example, when we were reading the article from Stanford, I looked at that and I thought, well, this is really nice, but it doesn't help me get people off the airplane. By the same token, I've written a whole lot about what they were discussing and have been amazed at how close social science and history really are to philosophy. And Wes, I confess to you, I'm really glad you guys weren't my professors because I've had a pretty exciting life. And if you guys had been my professors instead of the guy I had, I would have majored in philosophy and I wouldn't have been trekking through the hills of Pakistan then. So this has been okay.
And you said you've been using the podcast with your students, is that right?
Oh, yeah. You guys bailed a lot of them out. Especially, and I love the one on Voltaire. When I always thought Voltaire was pretty philosophical, and the way you guys kind of took him apart, I thought, oh, well, I like you anyway. But I have one young lady who just said to me, I had no idea how to write this paper. And I listened to the show you suggested on the Partially Examined Life, and my paper came together, and it did. She got an A, and she's very happy, and now she's one of your fans, too.
Right.
I just got a letter from somebody saying, I have a paper coming up. Do you want to write it for me? I'll give you $10.
$10. Wow.
Hey, for $10, I'll write the paper. Well, it's an academic salary. You guys know something about that. That's why you went out to make money, right?
Yes, now we're rich.
It says you're the executive director of the Homeland Defense Initiative. What is that exactly?
I could really come up with a good story. I can tell you the truth, and I guess I'll tell you the truth. I was consulting with the Department of Justice State and Local Anti-Terrorism Program prior to 9/11. And after 9/11, the government asked if I would take a leave of absence. And actually, they asked if they could pay Grand Valley my salary and just have me join the program full time for a while. It was supposed to be 6 months. It turned out to be 3.5 years. I was the dean of social science, and the president of the university created a position that would allow me to go out and help the federal government as well as state and local entities across the country. He created, through our board of trustees, the Homeland Defense Initiative. They gave me the title executive director in case I wanted to go back into administration because executive director, dean, kind of gives you some lateral flexibility.
Yeah.
But I actually only supervise myself. I keep getting the provost saying, and during my personnel review this year, I've examined my strengths and weaknesses and counseled me on what I do wrong. And I've recommended myself for a pretty good pay raise, but it doesn't seem to go.
Okay, so you made it up, in other words.
I'm an N of one. Hey, I consult with the government. That's what we do.
Yes. Wow. All right. Well, we have about 5 articles on the list. Let me just list them off. Actually, if you look at partiallyexaminedlife.com, there's a description both on this episode itself, and then usually there's a link for more information or to get the readings. I provide a couple paragraphs in each of these, but just to list them off, we had one by Angelo, Corlett, Can Terrorism Be Justified? That's from 1996. Another recent one, Donald Black's The Geometry of Terrorism from 2004. We had an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy by Igor Primoratz on terrorism. And then some historical sources. So one, The Philosophy of the Bomb, A Brief Response to Gandhi, which is associated with the Indian nationalist Bhagat Singh that was working at the same time as Gandhi in a less peaceful way. And then Karl Heinzen's Murder and Freedom from 1853. And the beginning of, we read Karl von Clausewitz's On War from, I guess he started writing at 1816 and didn't finish it before his death, so his wife put it out 1834. So that's a big list. And before we get into it, let's have a word from our sponsor.
I want to take this moment to thank our sponsor, Audible, which is a great provider of audiobooks and other spoken audio entertainment. They've got more than 100,000 titles to choose from in every genre you can think of, and you can listen to them wherever you want, on your smartphone or your MP3 player or on your computer. And as a PEL listener, you can get a free audiobook when you sign up for the service. Just go to audiblepodcast.com/PEL. Audible is a good way to prepare for our podcast episodes. It has unabridged audio versions of many of the classic philosophy titles we cover, including Platonic Dialogues, Kant, Nietzsche, and so on. There are also some good introductory works, such as Philosophy, a very short introduction. If you're looking for something related to the topic of the current podcast, you'll find that On War by Karl von Clausewitz is available unabridged. Or you might try a book by philosopher Nicholas Photion called War, Terrorism, and Violence. Photion is one of the major theorists in the area of philosophy of terrorism, and we touch upon his ideas briefly in this podcast by way of the Stanford Encyclopedia article. And remember, you'll get one of these books for free and help to support this podcast by going to audiblepodcast.com/PEL and signing up.
One of the statements in Donald Black, I think, is very succinct. He says that terrorism, the social geometry of terrorism, which occurs because of the modern age, we couldn't have terrorism as we experience it today in the 1850s because of physical proximity, didn't allow the upward movement of violence. But he concludes that terrorism ends up being a criminal justice matter and a quasi-war. That's where I think Clausewitz comes into play. He certainly didn't write about terrorism, but he did talk about principles inside of conflict. And when I read Mao and read Clausewitz, I see a lot of the principles coming together in what today we call terrorism.
You just mentioned something in summarizing Black's article that is a dichotomy or question that was with me throughout reading all this stuff. The distinction between the violence associated with war and the distinction of violence associated with criminality or police actions. And my own impression is that there's a kind of continuum both in states as well as acts of rebellion and stuff between things that we would call warlike acts and things that we would call criminal acts or police actions. And I think that distinction and trying to lay out whether it's a distinction in kind or a distinction in degree is at the heart of a lot of these articles. And I was wondering if you could clarify what kind of difference we're talking about.
If we look at military force, military application, as a statement of communication and an expression of political will, trying to dominate another political entity with your own political will, war becomes a means of communication, very violent communication with horrid outcomes. I'm not suggesting it's picking up the telephone, but it's sending a message. Terrorism is also a means of communication. It's communicating an ideology, it's communicating a religion, it's communicating a set of political grievances. But unlike war, which takes place inside an accepted set of international norms. Terrorism takes place in the shadows within criminal law. Succinctly, not all criminals are terrorists. In fact, very few criminals are terrorists, but all terrorists are criminals because they have to violate criminal law in order to carry out terrorism. And I think that's where the dichotomy occurs.
Maybe because so many terrorists claim political grievances against governments, it would be helpful to me to articulate why political grievances in the past and attempts at rebellion wouldn't qualify as a kind of terrorism, and what the boundary between the political entities we're talking about. I mean, I have some sort of idea about it, but it seems really murky, and it became more murky to me in reading these articles. In what you just said, it really turns a lot on what we mean by political entities and legitimate entities. And in the situation you just cited, the definition of being a criminal was just being not part of the political power. And that might be absolutely sufficient, but it makes the question of terrorism sort of just you're on the wrong side kind of thing. And I'm not sure that, well, certainly not everyone here agrees that that's the case.
Dylan, to answer your question, I think modernity has a lot to do with it, and Donald Black gets at that. I simplify him a lot because it helps me understand Donald Black. I think he's so profound, and it also helps my students. Looking at his article, we need three things in modern terrorism. We need an aggrieved party with the ability to travel and access to technology that can kill a lot of people. Looking at the Sepoy Mutiny in the middle of the 19th century, there were terroristic elements to it, but it was against the British population that was inside of India. Whether that's justified or not is a question of political perspective, but it was a particular type of violence. The mutineers were not going to go to London and set off a series of bombs, killing civilians around London to draw attention to their cause, because the technology didn't exist and the ability to travel, not incognito, but with the mass of people who are traveling, simply wasn't there. And I think modernity brings about that distinction with modern terrorism. And all the ambiguities you talk about are still there.
Yeah, I think this gets us to the, some of the philosophical articles that we looked at. The question is whether or not an act of violence is targeted at, say, non-combatants or innocents or whatever you want to call them. Although, we did read the Corlett article, which argues for a wider definition of terrorism, which is not necessarily aimed at non-combatants. But I think, by contrast, Primoratz in the Stanford Encyclopedia article, he argues for this definition of terrorism where you include in that definition the idea of targeting innocents or non-combatants. So you distinguish it outright from, say, guerrilla warfare or other types of activities that are, by the aggrieved party against, say, people who are considered to be perpetrators, say a military official or president of some regime or something like that.
And we would also distinguish essentially imperial activity that would take over territory and in which most of those living in that territory are not combatants in any way, yet they're subjected to violence by the imperial party. I mean, everybody from Rome to a variety of Greek states to Genghis Khan to imperial powers in the 16, 17, 1800s. They're taking over territory, they're taking over villages and killing people to get them to not resist, and in some cases those communities might be taking up arms. I guess there are the beginnings of the whole discussion of state terrorism, which one of the articles brings up, but we're kind of bracketing that off to the side.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, the Heinzen Murder and Liberty reading, which I thought was really rhetorically pretty amazing, right? But I mean, that's the kind of point that he's making, which is that, if you want to accuse the revolutionaries of being murderers when in fact states are built on murder. And so he's trying to eliminate all those distinctions. But I think it's a good question to say, what do we call? So during World War II, and this is something Primoratz brings up as well, you have the terror bombing of German citizens, which killed hundreds of thousands. So the German non-combatants were directly targeted because, at least initially, the English thought this is the only way to stop them. Basically, anything that feeds the war machine of Germany, including non-combatants, must be targeted, or we must demoralize the German people so much if that's what it takes to stop them. So what do we call that? Is that an act of state-sponsored terrorism, one that we might consider justified, or would we call it something else? I mean, I think that's a good question.
Yeah, the point is the terror part, then Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? We'll scare the crap out of them that we can destroy your entire country, so they will stop. It's pointed out that, you can correct me, John, but I guess, so the UN has tried to come up with a definition of terrorism just to be able to have resolutions about it.
Right.
And the countries won't agree because
right.
some of them want to